The panel asked us for our consent about whether we wish to be recorded, which is more than what I can say for the individuals who were being forced into these marriages, which I guess is a good place to start off in this debate. However, I want to make the comparative and the counterfactual relatively clear for everyone in this room, and just so that there are no false dichotomies being wagered by the opposition bench. One, this debate is not about war or marriage. That needs to be clarified from the get-go, because pre-existing political alignments and incentives are essentially what come as a precursor before a marriage can essentially be enshrined. The marriage, in this sense, for empires wishing to consolidate, is essentially a symbolic gesture for existing incentives for two empires to collaborate or combine in order to achieve some greater political goal. I think a great example of this is essentially the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had a great number of political interests to be able to align themselves to be able to counter the threat of Russia and Prussia. So that's the comparative in terms of the counterfactual, i.e., the alliances happen. They happen based on treaties and agreements that are based on paper rather than being symbolized by marriages between the royal families. The advantages and the benefits of that are something that I will get to a little bit later in my speech. But that's the comparative that I want to be very clear of. Does anyone have a clarification so far? Okay, moving forward then. What's the biggest thing that I want to put forward? I think the interesting thing and the easier thing that everyone needs to be able to understand is that these forms of marriages were essentially agreements between the heads of the families, between the political empires, between the royal families, and did not really take into account the consent of the individuals who were going to be forced into marriages. Because of them being symbolic, because of the political pressures essentially exerted onto the individuals who were going to be partaking in all of this, that essentially meant that a lot of the royal children that were growing up and from very young ages were essentially being groomed, and I do use the word light, not lightly here, but groomed essentially to be the idealized versions of spouses for their future husbands or future wives. And they were being trained in this manner from very young ages, often being married when they were 15 or 16 in and of itself. Given the fact that around the time of these empires, healthcare wasn't great and lifespans weren't expected to last all that long in any case, there was an added pressure of these individuals being married young, which means the pressures were being exerted on literally what would be classified nowadays as children. But more importantly, for women in particular, the added pressure was a particular way of acting. More importantly, a particular focus on making sure that they are primed for child rearing and childbirth, which essentially had a lot of harms in terms of how they were socialized, how their healthcare concerns were essentially ignored, how they were essentially put to death if they made the mistake of falling in love with anyone else, which happened in multiple examples throughout the status quo. I think the counterfactual way up over here is relatively easier, i.e. that these individuals are not going to be primed for these forms of political marriages. And even if the marriages are happening within upper class families, within their own neighborhoods, at least it is someone that these individuals are likely to be able to know, are likely to be able to form some form of romantic consensual relationships with, and are likely to be able to form a form of bond with where they are less coerced. We understand that women's rights don't magically change in this debate, but there is definitely less harm on the counterfactual that we want to claim as a very realistic impact. On that from CO.
This debate is about royal marriage for consolidation, but royal marriage, for example, for alliance or for other means still exists. I don't think that women have much choice either way, and men likely have consorts either way.
I literally explained why the differential necessarily matters here. And even if it is in the fringes, the benefit that at least women are able to curtail in terms of coercion is still something that's meaningful in this debate that needs to be understood. Second thing, and the benefit and the likelihood in terms of national alliances. And this is where I want to be really clear about the comparative from OG. Here, what we are able to accrue is essentially an alliance and agreement between empires wishing to consolidate on paper, instead of symbolizing it through marriage. Now, I want to be very clear on what alliances based on marriage necessarily ended up being like, because that essentially meant that you did not need to have any kind of binding terms or binding agreements written on paper on how the two entities were supposed to act. This is essentially why empires have been able to act with impunity on changing a lot of their declarations, a lot of their invasions, a lot of their military mobilizations on the whims of certain rulers dying or certain individuals within their greater kingdoms or in their greater fiefdoms acting in certain manners. that essentially means that without paper alliances, what you essentially have is a symbolic alliance which can essentially be undermined as long as there is potential for personal bickering within these marriages. I want to just highlight the previous point I made about how this further reduces the agency of the individuals who are married, who are in marriages, but I want to go on to the second point and make it very clear that this undermining risk essentially means that empires have the ability to be able to act with impunity. Essentially, if rulers are dying, if husbands are dying, if a wife is not able to bear children, that essentially means that these agreements can be undermined. But also, any perception or projection of political incentives not being met or political goals not being met means that the rules are essentially out of the window, which basically means that even if the marriages are there on paper, the symbolic gesture can basically be overruled and there are no rule-based criteria along which you can hold these individuals accountable. Why are we better in the counterfactual in terms of paper-based alliance or treaties? The treaties, by virtue of their name, outline a clear set of rules on how people are supposed to behave or how the entities are supposed to behave. There are precedents for treaties on what the economic alignments are supposed to be, what the rules are supposed to be, how the conduct is supposed to be, and what exactly happens if certain treaties are violated, which essentially means that this allows for the increasing pluralization of what a society and what an empire is supposed to necessarily conduct itself with. This also means that this allows for greater laws to be essentially checked and balanced within the empires themselves, which also then means that there is less propositions or less possibilities for individuals or individual rulers to be able to act without looking into the law into account. I want to make this very clear. This is not so much about the fact that the people are basically going to become liberated, but it is about the fact that this becomes an element through which people are able to point out to specific rules and treaties being put into place, and how those violations are essentially a mechanism through which they can take their complaints to the royal court or to whoever that they're able to be held accountable to. On the upside, these things are more tenuous, these things are more vague, and these things lead to a lot of harm, not just for the larger people, but definitely for the individuals proposed.
I'll have two arguments in my speech. First, I'll explain why the only way to prevent war between two empires is to get them into a win-win situation in which they both have incentives to cooperate, and why this happens under arranged marriage. And second, it will be a message argument about why this arranged marriage will both lead to acceptance of both, to mutual acceptance of both states to each other. I will start with 2 points of rebuttal. First of all, about the paper agreements. Note, it's not mutually exclusive. We can also have mutual paper agreements and also have arranged marriages, but also actually it's better to the our side, because when the woman sits in the room that takes all of the decisions and have say on the diplomacy of the other kingdom, it can lead to better agreements with the other kingdom, and therefore it will be more mutually accepting. Second of all, I do not care about the feeling of the queen, of the woman, if I'm going to prove to you that I'm going to save hundreds and thousands of lives. But more than that, we think that the woman was not going to hate this so much, at least to the level in which she will be willing to cooperate with this diplomatically and manage this in a good way. Why this is true? Because she is taught about this from age 0. It is like religion to her. She is not thinking about this as romance, or does not thinking about her own feeling. She is thinking about the whole kingdom. She is feeling a hero. She's feeling a feeling of legacy and making something huge and saving hundreds of lives. It's like religion. Agree with me that most people who are taught religion from age 0 does not leave the religion. Yeah, there are some people who do, but most of them they don't. And especially if leaving the religion means that you are giving up on being married to a king, which gives you millions of money and gives you so much incentives. Therefore, it's likely that the queen will cooperate, like the woman will cooperate with this and will like this. I'm starting my first point now about a win-win situation. We do not agree with the OG that this is only about mutual agreement and treaty. We think that this is the only way to prevent war in the historic times. Why this is true? Historically, empires did not believe in a free trade. They did not think that there's a possibility for a win-win situations between states. They thought that the only way to increase my power is by attacking the other side, stealing his stuff, and also, especially because I'm thinking he will attack me and wouldn't trust him. We think that this this is the only way to prevent this situation is to bring the two empires into a win-win situation. First of all, not that historically OG are lying. We're talking about two empires that have shared border that is so easy to attack each other, and you cannot trust. If you think that stealing from the other side will make you stronger, you will do it because it's like they are near you. Historically, we had wars of hundreds of years between empires. Now, why this is going to prevent the war by a win-win situation? First of all, it's a political say for the queen who is going to marry. That is, she is sitting in the rooms which would decide the orders and diplomatic issues. If there's a war, if there's an arrangement for a war, she is more likely to have a say to prevent it. But more than that, she is more likely to be able to convince the royalty not to do severe punishments to the other side. That is, if the king decides to send some criminals from the other side into murder, into how you said about like to murder him in public, she is being able to put feeling in the heart of the men and prevent a message of revenge from all of the other side. She also can convince the king to make projects in which people from the other country work in your state, and therefore they have money from cooperating from you, and they know that if they steal from you, they're going to get fired, or if they attack you, they're going to get fired and become poor. This brings the two states into a win-win situation. But more than that, once if I am as a citizen of country A, have my queen married to king of country B, I know that if I attack country B, my beloved queen is going to get attacked. Especially this is true for the royal people who are taking the orders. Therefore, they know that they are attacking the other side is attacking my beloved queen, who I think about her as religiously divine. My religious leaders supported her. She is my greatest symbol. I do not want the other countries to suffer because this means my queen is going to suffer. Before I continue with the second argument, I will take a second. Yeah.
Some of the greatest wars in Europe were those of succession. Perhaps you prevented initial invasion, but the existence of that marriage was nearly always reinforced with violence.
Always what?
Was reinforced with violence.
Few reasons why this is true. First of all, as explained, why the woman was taught from age 0 to be diplomatic about this. If there will be start to be some rivalry in the family, the queen knows how to treat this. This is first. But two, it's likely that there will be also shared information between the two countries. And if you start hearing about resisting, you have more option of time to prevent this. But three, note that the comparative is also a continuous war, and in our side, you are more likely to prevent this. Second point is about the message argument, why we are not going to get a secession because it will be supported from both sides because it will lead to mutual acceptance. First of all, it's how this ceremony looks like. You have the king of your country making a fancy speech about accepting the other side, that the other side is going to join you, is going to be a blood from your own blood. It's going to be your main king is saying that they are giving symbols of peace, and your main king trusts them. If you do not trust the king, you have a revolution either way. But we are talking about cases in which your king is considered religiously important, and you do trust him. This is first. But two, you get acceptance, formal acceptance from religious leaders of both sides. That is, religious leaders of both sides now have the incentive to say that other side is also divine. Why this is not symmetric? Because they are going to have a child together. And the act of having a child together, in which you are mixing your bloods, and in which you are making a divine act of merging your bodies and creating a new body that is representing both of you, is considered having as half the divinity of both the king and the queen. This means that the religious leaders can accept the other side, the new-born child, as divine. They cannot just invent that the other king is divine because they somewhat now decided this after 100 years of war in which they say that the other side is the devil. The only way to convince them to accept the other side as divine is to get this newborn child, which mixes the blood of both ways, have the divine blood of both sides, and therefore you also get acceptance of religious people, of religious leaders, because people are super religious in these days. This religious acceptance will lead to more peace from the public people and more acceptance from the public people.
I'm going to start with some rebuttal against opening opposition. So the first point of any sort of influence of the wife or queen concubine or whatever on the ruler of a nation necessitates a sort of personal involvement of the king and his assigned queen. We think that that's very unlikely for two reasons. Firstly, like kings have a whole bunch of concubines, kings have very many women who are made available to them, and they don't choose themselves to a significant degree which sort of political wife that they choose. So we think it's incredibly unlikely that any sort of like personal or emotive intertwining of the two exists. Also, historically speaking, it does not exist, which would lead to the sort of benefits that opening opposition here is talking about, of like a mediation of interaction via the respect that the loving king has for his wife. We think that that is just unlikely. Secondly, when it comes to the child, like when the child is raised in a certain majoritarian household, like he or she, most likely he, is raised in a context by the ruling class, by courtesans of the king in the majoritarian part of the empire, meaning that any sort of representation of the minority part of the empire through the socialization of the child is extremely unlikely at the point at which the child is born and socialized in the majoritarian part of society, regardless of where it is born. Thirdly, the idea of religious approval. We think that that is a very, very niche case and also doesn't project to society because A, if you have Catholic and Protestant kingdoms, like there's not necessarily going to be any sort of religious approval there in any case, but even if you have two Catholic kingdoms like France and Austria, as soon as you have someone like Marie Antoinette as the wife coming in from Austria into France, then the rejection of the society because of their maybe justified hatred of Austria would very much offset any sort of religious approval of the wife. And this is very much the crux of this debate, because if your population, if your courtesans, if the political structure of your kingdom rejects or dislikes the union that is going to be created for political reasons, for personal reasons, for power reasons, then they're going to project this dislike onto the wife who is marrying into this family. And simply the act of marrying does not have any sort of transcendent properties that you, as a duke in the kingdom, suddenly think, okay, I lose relative power in the kingdom due to this union with the Austrians, but hey, I like the lady so much, so somehow it's okay. I think this is deeply, deeply improbable. But the converse is also true, that if the political union is accepted by the majority of the political class, the dukes, the courtesans, etc., then that also goes to an acceptance of the wife. However, it does not cross, and furthermore, the acceptance of the wife would equally lead to an acceptance of any sort of paper political document, which we pose as the plausible alternative. Why is this the case? Because the prerequisite on either side of the house of any sort of union happening is there to be a political coincidence of the interests of the ruling classes of the two nations or fiefdoms that want to form a political union. Why is this the case? Because the act of a political marriage is just a ratification of a treaty. It is just a confirmation of an alignment of interests that needs to exist beforehand, necessarily, because if you did not have this alignment of interest as one state, then you would not ratify a treatment by selling off your daughter in order to unify with another state. The only two cases in which this happens is if either the one state has been defeated militarily already and they're forced to basically sell off their daughter, in which case you could also subjugate them with a treaty, or the second case where the two nations think it is in their beneficial interest to unify, in which again you could just go for a treaty. What is the first reason why this is so important? That is what Uzair already gives you, that the act of using women as tokens of allegiance and tradable commodities sets back any sort of women's liberation by decades. Because unlike what opening opposition says, this is not just something that happens to the ruling family, but the ruling family sets the social narrative for the rest of society, and that means that business families now also see a viable path of consolidating their two empires to be marrying their daughters and their sons together against their own interests. This happened well into the 20th century due to the precedents set through 800 years of European history, and we think that this is a bad thing, because if the ruling class goes ahead to show that this is no longer a viable option or never was a viable option, then the rest of society, who historically has tried to emulate the ruling class because they envy the power of the ruling class, would be less incentivized to follow this sort of behavior for themselves. POI closing.
So just to be clear, consolidation means that the empire becomes more centralized. I think that the likely case isn't between two different countries that then become one country, but rather internal consolidation, marrying people from within your own country to increase consolidation, centralization.
I honestly didn't understand that acoustically, I'm very sorry. Second point, like constructive point, if not the marriage, necessarily the treaty is the alternative. Why is this the case? Well, as I already mentioned, a token of ratification is the only way of actually confirming any sort of alignment between states, or also an agreement between two, like potentially warring or conflicting states like Austria and France. If treaties, like a piece of paper, rather than the physical body of the ruling class, is used as something to ratify this treaty, this has knock-on effects that are to the benefit of the society. Why is this the case? If states enter unions with other states or agreements with other states on the basis of a piece of paper, then it is necessarily a legal process and not a physical, like body process. It is obviously still initiated by the king, and the legitimacy to the piece of paper is given by the king who signs the piece of paper. However, the piece of paper is now the document and source of the union of the two states. This is critically important because this is the differentiation between monarchical totalitarianism, where the monarch could do whatever they want, and a system where the monarch has to at least write down a set of rules that then they can decide, but they themselves also need to adhere to. And this is critical because it leads to one level of separation between the power that is enacted on the citizens of the state and the ruler of that state. And it also means that the rest of the ruling class see the source of legitimate power and the basis of government of the state stemming increasingly from the pieces of paper that the king signs, and not what the king says in whatever mood he is at any given moment, and what his physical body via marriage does. This is critical because this is a manner of thinking that is vitally necessary for society to progress from totalitarianism into legalism. And legalism is a system under which even if the king makes the documents, you do have some protection from arbitrary enactment of power, you do have some protection from the king doing whatever he or she wants, and this is in and of itself a good thing and the prerequisite for modernity and the society that we live in today. Proud to propose.
If OG wants to prove that this motion is going to be the thing that will change totalitarianism to legalism, I think they have a major problem. I think that we can notice that why papers, as Rami said beforehand, are just the papers. There are no incentive to respect them if you are suspecting that the other one is going to attack you, is going to hurt you. You don't have the technology in that time in order to understand from where the person and where the different army is going to come and from where you can steal from the other side. Therefore, the only way to put trust in the hands of the people that are making the decision is by marriage, is by putting a person inside the room where it happens. We believe that is an extremely important thing to do, and we believe that is extremely unique at our side. Please note, they try to explain to you why it's going to be a problem for the woman, for the man, for the person that got married, but never really explain to us how the process of making this decision are usually look like, how they are usually thinking. Let's please pay note for that. Usually they are having different past experiences that normalize that to them, that made them show that it's like a real thing that already happened, this is the way that the world works. If her sister and her uncle and her aunt are done that before and moved to other countries and have been projected to her as a source, as a royal person that do his duty for the job, for the kingdom, for the people themselves, it's highly likely to think that this is the way that she will be raised and this is the way that she will believe this true. The opinions of the society. When everybody is talking about you in a good way, when you are seeing that this kind of thing is important, that this is unique, which is the most of the opinion that you are usually being exposed to, it's highly likely that you believe that you are doing a good thing, that you are encouraging yourself in order to pursue the great. You don't believe that marriage should be or will be a thing for love, because this is a thing and this is a tool that has been chosen and has been born in order to save our people and to save any conflict that can occur in the first place. And therefore we believe that in this kind of situation, even if our case is definitely not linked on the fact that she will be pleased by that, because we believe that we are doing much greater impact and much greater people, we don't think that the magnitude of the damage that they are presenting on their side is high. We believe that on the contrary is extremely low. But it's also important to note that they are trying to say to us that the people in the society themselves, they will not be pleased, they will be angry. And we believe that it's not true for several reasons. They are first of all just happy that the king or the queen are trying to give them more quiet. The comparative for that is war. Usually people are being sick and tired from war, and the moment that they are seeing there is a sort of a desire for a change, that there are a person that is trying to take another initiative in the zero-sum game that they are all believe that the world works like until, I don't know, the end of the Second World War II. We believe that it's an extremely important thing. B, they have really low criticism. Usually they are not really educated people. They didn't study for much. They are being taught what the king told them they want to hear from different sources of information, and therefore they are usually more lean to do it. And C, and most important, the relationship that they have with the person that's giving them that information. Usually it's a relationship of love. It's a relationship of admiring, because just like the past experiences of the king, the queen, and whatever, they have been raised and taught that the king knows best, that he do whatever he wants and whatever is being desired for the kingdom itself. And therefore we believe that the population itself is going to be extremely acceptance for this kind of marriage and is going to be extremely happy for that. Now, another thing that is extremely important to note. They try to give us the impression that she will not have or he will not have any sort of way to to affect and to make a change inside the kingdom itself. We believe that it's not true for several reasons. When you are in a political convention with these people, even if you are not in the room that making the specific decision, you are speaking with them after the convention. You are making different chats with them. Not yet. You're thinking and you're trying to make a soft change by knowing them. But B, even if she's not affecting them while for the conversation, she still speaks with the king afterward. When he's trying to make a different war, a different case, he needs to go after that to bed and to explain to her while they're sleeping why it's going to happen. And even if he has several wives, she's still going to be in the palace. She's still going to be a part of the day, and it's definitely going to be something that is completely going to minimize the cost and the desire. And see, even if their people are going to are going to try to make a specific change. What is my time? 5. Thank you, sir. And even if they are going to try to make a specific change, they still need to think about how she will react and how the king will react after they make this specific decision. Because this thing caused a political inconvenience, we're thinking that it's an extremely unlikely thing. Thank you so much. We believe that it's an extremely unlikely thing to do and something that is extremely unlikely to happen. And yes, maybe this thing is not going to change all of the war that already happens, but we think that it's going to definitely minimize the amount of wars in a great magnitude without any specific way that could happen beforehand. Before I will move to my weighings, second please.
Whenever royal marriages occurred, local nobles lost power to new princes from foreign dynasties, at which point they had massive incentives to resist this influence by generating conflict with the new dynasty. This was not a win-win situation, but generated massive infighting.
Yeah, we don't think that the massive infights will happen because that's all of the reason that I explained beforehand. We believe that the people in the palace are really receptive to that, the people in the streets are really receptive to that, and all of this different around. We believe that it will not be perfect, but it will definitely create a bigger change for the good than everything that they try to perceive. Several reasons why we believe that Rami arguments about deducing wars is definitely the most important thing in this debate, and definitely more important about the specific person that is going to go there. The magnitude of the people. In their world, we have 2, 10, 20 people that are going to be forced to be taken into marriage if we believe that they are not desired to. In our worlds, we have tens upon millions of people that are going to be forced to war, are going to be forced to go and fight and be killed and to be out of their situation. We are not understand why we need to prefer this kind of population upon this kind of population, and definitely we choose the higher one. B, the magnitude of that. When we are starting an extreme war, an empire falls, we cannot understand the magnitude of the damage that happened. If we are looking at the Roman Empire, for example, the 1,000 years of darkness that have been received beforehand was extremely big, and it was extremely important, and definitely more big than the life of those people that we are ready to sacrifice, which we don't believe that we are sacrificing as yet. And C, unreversibility. It's hard to stable countries. It's hard to stable conflicts. It takes years upon years to fix them. Thank you so much.
We from Closing Government posit that royal marriages did play an important role in the legitimacy, the continuation, the consolidation of those empires. And sure, as Opening Government puts it, it is symbolic, but the symbolic does have power. Because even if we are not talking about democracies where people can vote and decide what happens and be the masters of their own destiny, the people fundamentally still matter. They played a role in the military, the economy, and religious institutions utilize these narratives massively through grand gestures, acts of the divine, and moments of revelation in unison. Even if politics preceded the marriages, as Opening Government points out, these marriages had political consequences that even ring further back to a few centuries. Just to face it and frame it, we think it is important to note that there are two types of marriages we are talking about. The first are the ones between empires and states to consolidate their power between themselves, but the second part are the ones that happen within states and empires that already exist to consolidate power even further down the line. And I think through that second one, we're far more likely to access and see the most pernicious types of harms that happen. The comparative I'd like to note, and I think Opening Opposition tries to put this out there, is that this is not a that the false dichotomy they put out there is one of marriage, no marriage, and then you have war. If, as an empire, you had the capacity to conquer with war, you would have done that no matter what, no matter the amount of losses. And the reasons for that are kind of simple, because it's just the pragmatic thing to do. For one, you hold absolute and complete power, and you answer to fucking no one. The second thing to note is that you do not face risk. I don't know that much about that history, but based on the kind of vibes I do understand, it's kind of risky. There's a lot of backstabbing. There is not a lot of trust that you can place between these families and individuals, and a lot of shit just goes down, right? Thirdly, you do not have to legitimize why your empire is now changing, why you're giving up certain parts of power, and that is the POI that Krish gave to Opening Opposition. The response of, this is not likely to happen. Well, empirically, it did happen, and those consequences are to be considered within the context of this round. So, at the end of the day, you're far more likely in these instances, if you do have the capacity to just conquer with war, you're going to do that anyway. So what is the comparative then? And I think Opening Government outlines a few of these. You're simply going to still have these political treaties, but I just want to note that sometimes nothing happens, right? Sometimes moves do not happen if you do not have the particular capacity, the particular incentive, and you do not have the particular specificity of time at your hand to do something. You might just be passive. Because what the goal of your empire at point B is to provide stability for yourself, is to provide stability and safety for the people who legitimize your power. Those are your courts, those are your princes, dukes, etc. So at a point of time when war is the only option you have, and you're not likely to win with that war, and you do not have these marriages at your disposal, I don't think it is that likely that you're just going to go to war and potentially lose your own empire. So the first thing I'd like to note is why are wars more horrible on the opposition side of the house? It's because you have wars of succession. That was, for example, the Spanish War of the Spanish Succession. What happens essentially in those instances is that you have two different nations that hold a particular claim as an heir to an empire. That means that the stakes are kind of high, and in those instances, you kind of want to do everything within your own capacity to conquer and get control of that empire. Note, if you do not have these types of marriages, if you do not have the legitimacy that if I defeat the other heir, if the other heir doesn't exist, then I have the full claim to myself, then you simply do not have that war happening. That means less people dead. That in and of itself is a net negative that I think needs to be considered. The second thing to note is on Christian's POI, right? As to why you're likely to have the types of wars that happen in these particular courts and so forth. What is important to note there? Because royal marriages are just not used between different states, but they're also used within your own empire. At a point of time when they lose certain when those trade-offs are being done, you're likely to increase the chance of conflicts and uprisings happening. I did forget a paper. This is fucking bad. Oh, fucking found it. Fantastic. So, the reason why we value this is because local courts and nobles lose power in these instances, leading to a degree of separationism that is important to consider. Because they do not want to have any type of loss of their agency, of the particular power that they hold in these instances. The third thing to note is generally on empires themselves. Because if we consider that sometimes this expansion simply won't happen, this consolidation won't happen, and empires remain the same, the fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves is, why are empires bad? And why increasing the size of them is bad? There are two reasons for this. The first is to note that empires themselves, more often than not, do not have an incentive to rule all of the land that they own and hold a claim towards, and all of the people that are under it. Why? There are two reasons for this. Firstly, that they're distant to them, meaning that you do not have the access to information that you have in the present day. So information comes with kind of a delay towards you in a second. Meaning in those instances, your understanding of risk is kind of low and misguided in a lot of instances. B, you have the ability to subjugate and suppress people, meaning that you do have no incentive to rule them in the positive manners that we kind of envision a lot of times. Even though empires were kind of shit most of the time, they still had capacity to provide positivity to individuals. The second thing to note is that you do not have the capacity to rule, meaning that you do not have the knowledge of the areas that they hold a position of power over, or the capital that is necessary in these instances. Opening.
The potential heirs know that even though they do not get to be kings, they do gain a lot from gifts from the other candidate who sends money to their country. There's likely to be agreements in the family wide because this marriage is prepared for years and people are educated from age zero.
I'm terribly sorry this microphone echoed so bad to me back here that I couldn't understand a thing. I hope Krish can catch this and is likely to respond to this. What is the end weighing here and why we think it is important? Because at a point of time, when you have these royal marriages, what they're used as is a tool of legitimization. That is to say, people existing within the empire, for example, now that you are from that minority state and a royal marriage is being formed with someone from your state, that is a token of legitimization and a token of grace. Why is this important to consider? Because it is a legitimate tool that can suppress uprisings that are legitimate. Why? Because individuals who would otherwise, and collectives and nations and nationalities that would have uprisen to the empires that were subjugating them, are no longer doing that. Because they're getting some type of political win from themselves, right? Meaning, cultures and individuals simply die out. They get perished. They do not have the nation state or the culture of their own. The second thing to note is that the unnecessary conflict still persists, i.e. the courts are still fighting with each other. So you do have wars, but those wars are not fought for nothing. Meaning, you get more wars in the current comparative. If you do not have these royal marriages, you do not get that as much. It is enough of reason to regret them. Closing government.
One very simple case coming from CEO. Notice we're going to talk about internal consolidation, and we're going to talk about why on our side we have significantly less internal stress, significantly less rebellion, significantly more people that have the trust of the emperor, which means that they're willing much more to cooperate with them, much less rebellion, much more cooperation. We're not talking about the big stuff such as full-out wars such as OO. We do agree that those are rare. We do agree that specifically in those cases those are rare, because as OG pointed out, we're talking about countries that in both sides are somewhat okay with each other, and we don't think that an all-out war is what is important to talk about. But we do think that still, even if they're okay, we do think that on our side they're going to consolidate much better, they're going to cooperate much better, they're going to work together and be in a much better situation on our side. Let's get into it. Why do we have much more internal consolidation on our side? First of all, because people trust much more the leader. Notice that on both sides, the people trust a lot their own elite. Notice that at least they're trusting them much more than they do the elite of the alien invaders and all that. Notice that this is because people grown up on the propaganda on how great and how important those duchies that are controlling them are, how much they're taking care of them. This is where they grow up to like them. This is where they grow up to trust them. Notice moreover they are feeling like they are one of them, as in they are a part of my nation. They are talking my language. They are a part of my culture. They are a part of my religion. All of this means that I feel very much connected to the emperors, to the monarchy that is controlling me and has controlled me since I was born. Notice on side government, what happens is that a ruler that is coming from the outside and takes control. He maybe even murders your leader. This is where you hate them. This is where you do not trust them. Notice that on our side, there's much more cooperation. The leader that is coming is the leader that I am connected to, is now giving legitimacy to the new leader, is now actively accepting them, actively cooperating with them, and this is where we get much more legitimacy that the people give to this leader, much more trust that they give to the people. Notice, second of all, when we're talking about not only control over the people, but also control over the key positions, as in, notice when we're talking about the duchess, the people who have land, all of those nobility, notice that all of those trust much more the people that, when you are marrying them. Notice that once you're marrying this queen, you're not only getting them, you're also getting all the people, all the nobles that are below her, that she has a significant connection to, that she has significant influence on. Notice that those are the people who feel connected to, those are the people who are dependent on her. Notice that those are also the people who know they can trust her. Notice that those nobles know her, trust her, they have a history with her, and they know that they're not supposed to be scared of her because they know they have a long history and that she was perfectly fine with them. Notice that when someone else comes, notice that when someone who they did not know, notice when someone who they cannot trust, notice that this is scary. This is someone who they don't know whether or not he's going to do something against them, and this is where you're much more scared of them, this is where you trust them much less, and this is where you're much more afraid and much more willing to do something preemptive because you're not trusting that they're not going to do something to screw you over. Notice, third of all, notice that the nobles and the strong families are much less mad at you, because you notice that this is important to know, the vast majority of the cases where we're talking about those nobles, they were from the same family as the leader that you on our side married, on their side killed, or whatever. Notice, what does it mean? It means that on their side you're mad at them because they killed one on your family. On our side, do you have much more willing to cooperate, and you much more have influence over them and control over them, and this is where you're much more in a fine proposition with them. Before I continue to why it's so significant, yes.
You explain why you would trust the Duke. You do not explain why in a deeply sexist and regressive society you would trust the Duke's second daughter.
You will trust them much more. The daughter has much more influence over them. They are part of the family. They are someone who you trust. They are someone who is part of the culture. All of my analysis does stand both for them and for all of the nobility. Let's get into it. Notice specifically, this is not only a way of getting influence. This is a unique and pretty much the only way of getting this kind of consolidation. Because notice that when we talk about feudality, you could not control everything. This is a big country. There are a lot of nobles that each and every one of them has somewhat independent control over their area. Notice that there is a very limited communication. Notice that there is a very limited enforcement, because you do not know how much someone earned and how much taxation they owe you. You do not know what is happening in each territory. You cannot control everything. The only way of actually getting significant cooperation is by having them on your side. Why is it? What does it all mean? It means that on our side we have so much more internal consolidation. We have more obedience. We have more paying taxes. We have less rebellion. All of it happens on our side. Why is it so crucial? Notice, first of all, it means that on our side we can do huge projects. We have more cooperation. We have more people paying taxes. All of it means that we can create infrastructure, train that span the whole countries and allow people to move from one place to another and develop the whole economy. Bridges that develop areas and make some places livable and connect places. Grain silos, all of those places that actually improve the economy and make it go 10 steps beyond. Notice, moreover, we talk about academy. Notice, yes, it was done in order to glorify the king and all that, but still it is something that is great that it was done. Notice that the reason by getting the academy, we got science, we got philosophy, we got medicine. All of it would not have happened if we did not get this consolidation, if we did not get this central control that controls all the resources and can build all of those great things. Notice that this means that the reason why we got the modern state, the reason why we have all the things that are huge and incredible in our modern life is because of this internal consolidation. If we did not have it, we could not have any of that. Lastly, it also means less rebellion. We're not talking about full-out wars, but still, we're talking about nobles that decide to rebel against you, decide not to pay taxes, decide to go in a rebellion because they're scared of you, and we're telling you that this is also something that is awful because this is a waste of both resources, but more importantly, lives, and this is something that is awful. Notice that when we're getting this distrust, all of it means that we're getting much more of this kind of rebellion. All of it happens much less when we have much more consolidation, especially internal consolidation. All of it means that we have much more of a functioning country that can build great stuff.
Debates about medieval history are perhaps notoriously difficult to judge, so I want to start off with making the counterfactual as clear as possible. The counterfactual is not one of war, given that war at the time was very expensive, logistically a nightmare because it took like weeks to send a single letter, and you needed support from a massive amount of nobles, which is kind of hard to do when you have hundreds of them with different interests. Rather, in order to fulfill the imperial ambitions that states had, the very likely form of increasing soft power was through local investment, such as having the best castle, having the best gallery, etc., which are probably much more preferable forms of soft power, producing cultural achievements like the Versailles, and which are probably legitimately one of the greatest artifacts that we have today. The importance of this counterfactual shows that we get the same benefits that CO wants to get in terms of their magnificent projects by just showing that the likely pivot is the type of soft power which also produces these projects. But the critical implication then is that royal families simply remain significantly more localized and there is much less intermarriage. This also disarms the most potent part of the OO attack, which is that you, to some extent, prevent a level of war. We posit the counterfactual is one where these wars are not engaging in either way. To clarify, royal marriages were used in two ways. One, you marry into another independent country's family, your prince with their princess. You hope that the patron, i.e. their current king, dies, and then you form a personal union. Your prince takes the throne of the other state, but also sits on your own. One guy controls two states, consolidation at its best. Examples of this, Burgundian inheritance, the Spanish Habsburgs, etc. Second way, you marry with nobles within your own state, which is used to provide power in court in exchange for some types of favors, for example, the royal courts of Poland, Lithuania. The initial action, as OG points out, is indeed symbolic, but the consequences are exceptionally political, and it is to advance the power of the central government. Let's take a look at opening opposition, because by destroying a lot of the presumptions that they take, we also take out CO. And I want to talk about court dynamics here primarily. Royal marriage was not a win-win for everybody. The country of the male partner was obviously significantly better off, because they came to be to a position of dominance over the foreign court that they didn't have before. Who then lost dominance as a result of this action? The nobles from the state of the bride, because now there was some other guy that married in who now influenced the monarchy, which meant that you were comparatively worse off of your influence over the state than you were before. What does this mean? That meant that you began scheming, you began spreading rumors, etc., in hopes that the current king disowns the new prince, which means that oppositional narratives by royal marriages often down the line were empowered en masse, which caused things such as splits in courts, things like civil conflict and secessionism, which obviously is bad in and of itself because it led to bloodshed. But later down the line, there were also ethnic considerations of this. For example, if I am in the French court, why is the person sitting on the throne an Austrian? And these were things that fundamentally fueled massive amounts of division within the royal courts of Europe, destroying also most of what CEO tries to tell you about consolidation. Second, the royal successions can be relatively difficult because they're bundled up in ancient tradition and law. If Austria and France had members of their dynasty in line for the Spanish throne, there was an incentive to convince that their guy should take it once the current king dies. This diplomacy is obviously not win-win. There's no way to negotiate in a way that both of you get the throne, which in reality led to some of the longest and bloodiest wars in Europe. Here's another claim. If I had a claim as a dynasty on a throne, I had to protect that state because I had potential claim over its resources once the old king died. When the old king then dragged that state into war, I had to join in as a state to save my prospective claim to it, massively escalating initially minor conflicts into full-blown wars. Now, the second implication that we get from opening up is that the queen has some level of influence to the extent that she can do diplomacy, etc., make these conflicts much better, and so on and so forth. My question is, let's assume that the queen does in fact perhaps then have some level of influence. But the question that remains unanswered in opposition is how the queen would actually use this. Because look at the motion. This is about the consolidation of empires. This is the age of imperialism. The queen is not going to be like, yo, I'm in the court. Maybe you should be really kind and do diplomacy. diplomacy. No, it's to repress the guys who want to resist our empire. It is to declare war on your enemies. It is to do our dirty work. That is the influence that these queens levied, if they had any in the first place. Why? Because if you're already royally married into another state, you guys are probably on relatively good terms with the current king or queen anyways, given that they've just given you the hand of their heir. How do we outweigh opening government and really all other themes in the debate? Now, opening government puts out a few good ideas in terms of the oppression of brides, etc. But this was probably horrible in any way, right? I hate this trend in debating as well of symmetricization, but as CEO points out, like, it was just a bad time to be a woman of any standing. Their second claim is that the counterfactual would have been one of legal dominance, of having more peace to those means. Maybe. But I posit this is quite speculative and also kind of symmetrical, because treaties to some extent existed anyway. What do we show then? We show that royal marriages in and of itself, by the political interlinking that they caused, very much escalated and created independent sources of conflict and war, because they were used as a tool of expansion when war was impossible but perhaps too costly in that instance, but later caused wars when control over these royal marriages and the type of political power that they provided had to be maintained. Before I move on, opening?
The family of the woman is maybe weaker than the male family, but they are still getting huge fancy subsidies from the male country. Since they have really much to lose, they are not going to risk war for the chance of getting slightly stronger.
Yeah, the fact that you get financial subsidies is exactly why you're probably going to risk war, because you've already invested into that state, into making them your friend, to allow you to royal marry them in the first place. So now, if that state is going to be threatened, you're going to be very passionately defending your claim, because you have a fundamental sunken cost fallacy, probably one of the most fundamental mechanisms of debate. Do I really have to weigh the fact that we have more war on our side of the house on CO? Because I posit that everyone knows that war is a relatively bad thing, a lot of people die, and you have a level of economic catastrophe. Of course, the claim that we're defending is not that there is no war on the opposition side, but rather this interconnectedness led to massive escalation and proliferation of the types of wars that occurred. The final piece of weighing here is thus. Perhaps you truly believe that as a result of this, there were certain instances where, for example, governments cooperated better. Who prevents from this cooperation? Probably the intelligentsia, the aristocrats, etc., who owned the economic means of production. But who then lost from some of the wars that happened in excess on our side of the house? The poor soldiers who probably had no agency in being drafted, and they're probably significantly more vulnerable given that they came from fundamentally disadvantaged positions. They were agents that were then co-opted by these royal families in their hunger for power, and by the diplomats that wanted to live in privilege, and to sustain that privilege, they had to enact the worst types of violence. For all those reasons, closing opposition.
The traditional existence of mankind has been nasty, brutish, and short. Mankind died, but not just due to war, due to famine and unequitable access to resources, because of disease which was rampant, because of injury which was untreatable and got infections and crippled people without modern medical technology. This was way more constant in war, affected everyone, even when they were at peace. This affected way more individuals, not just soldiers in the battlefield or the little bit of cities that were pillaged, but rather every single peasant. 99% of the population were consistently dying, but not even that. Outside of death, people suffered day to day, constant work and toil in agriculture, in the field, breaking yourself, no autonomy, no capacity to change your life. You suffered, you didn't live life which was worth living. But even then, it was huge fucking poverty, because you constantly needed to farm up, because you didn't have access to any resources. You could not build Versailles, you could not build locally, you could not build everything that CG says you would build locally, because you did not have access to any such resources that would allow you to advance. The only thing that solved this is modernity through centralization. When states centralized, they could take more resources from everyone and invest it locally, create a local academy for the honor of the king with intellectuals and political philosophers to invent new ideas such that wealth is not static and you can invent it more, or to invent modern science and medicine by researching for the benefit of the king. You could create standing armies that required massive bureaucracy that could then raise more taxes and centralize the state more, leading to modern welfare, allowing individuals to reach to get a lot more food and a lot more stuff like that. This solved the problems, got science, got the wealth, got the capacity to solve individuals. This impact is not only way the fuck larger than the rest of the room, but also note that it also solves the war impact, right? Because when states are richer and more interdependent with one another, they fight less objectively. Therefore, largest impact in the debate. It's also the most likely impact of the debate. I don't know why teams focused so fucking much on alliances between two independent states. Obviously, when two independent states would marry, they have an interest to stay independent and not unite if they can produce different heirs. I do not want a different family to control my own state by the marriage. Therefore, consolidation is not what royal marriages were used. They were used primarily for alliances and very rarely for consolidation, if at all. The likelier case of consolidation is internal. I marry another individual for the capacity for them to cooperate with me more, so this just happens way the fuck more than external consolidation. Then, against opening opposition, the wing is super simple. A, on impact. Not only is the impact likelier and bigger, but it's also super important against government teams and specifically CG. Opening opposition say we get less external war, CG says we get more war and oppression. The way here is at least very unclear. By getting you a huge impact that only happens on side opposition, we tip the debate far more for side opposition. But also, I think that even if you buy some of the OO analysis of like you can use this to prevent war, which might as well work for our case, I think that A, by pointing out the problem, what prevented centralization, we explain specifically why alliances are uniquely important for centralization, and therefore unlock the impact of the case only after this explanation. But B, note that I think we also have many analytical extensions as to why this prevents more war, and helps that when we explain that the queen doesn't just have lobbying power over the king, she also has it over the entire court. When we explain the level of trust that people place on the family dynasty, when we explain the fact that you can form alliances and use them against other individuals within your state, so you ally with the largest noble family and then oppress other noble families to get them to be more centralized. So there are also many analytical extensions on that burden as well, on top of the impact. Now, why do we beat government teams? First of all, on closing government, on their claim of wars of succession. A, I just think that their model of external war of succession is very unlikely, both because, again, the weighing above, but also know that even if they win, since their impact is local nobles aren't happy with you and demand privileges, this is not consolidation. This is not royal marriages impacting consolidation, so this is not really the debate. So it's both unlikely and not the debate. Also note that it's likely that the internal faction will win such a civil war. Fighting wars during the medieval age or the early modern age was very hard, right? Logistics was very hard to provide, supply lines, you didn't know the terrain, you wouldn't have accurate maps, so it's likely that the local nobles would have won anyways, making the majority of that case mute. Lastly, I think that actually wars of succession, in terms of how they impact consolidation, which is a far larger impact than the war itself, far longer term and impacts more, are actually very good for consolidation, just because of the reason that it means that people focus on the central court more. When I fight a war of succession, I focus on court intrigues. When I win the war of succession for my side, I acquiesce to the claims of the court and cooperate with the central court, which gives me more privileges. This means that more people cooperate with the central court, consent to the power of the central court, and thus we get more centralization. Then, on the claims that empires suck, I guess that's true, but not that A, we actually solve all of these incentive capacity problems when we get more nobles to exist and generate a larger impact, but also note that we are the only team that actually provides an impact on that scale of magnitude, right? Even if you get less wars in opening opposition, they never showed you why, like, oppression is also very important. Our impact is far larger than oppression. We solve oppression in the larger term when we create liberalism and all other things of modernity. I think that we just explain why, even if their impact is true, we win on it far more. Before we move on, I would like closing.
Royal marriages empowered nobles. The greatest move towards centralization, i.e. the age of absolutism, precisely did the opposite by dispowering the nobles.
Please read that again slowly.
Royal marriages empowered nobles. The greatest move towards centralization in history, i.e. the age of absolutism, precisely did the opposite.
Okay, I think that this is a misunderstanding of history. What happened during absolutism was, for example, that France and the HRE, during all of medieval age and feudalism, fought against one another. What enabled feudalism was the king finally getting the power over his nobles, and the way that the king got the power over his nobles had to be through the nobles consenting to the king, because as CG analyzed for themselves, there was no capacity to do so without the nobles conceding, because they had all of the local power and stuff like that. Therefore, in order to get the power of the age of absolutism, you need the local nobles to consent. Only happens on side opposition. Then, on opening government. The opening government impacts are very weak, so I just want to answer their meta. First claim about the fact that if an alliance would exist, it would exist anyways because of material incentives. This is a place without population censuses, without any understanding of local maps, where you can't just check what the other side is, where there's a strong court life that's far more proximate and stronger to you. I don't think that this is just like the modern state where material incentives exist. I think there's a lot more interpersonal incentives, because that's what individuals could actually access. You can't access how much stronger the other duchy is. You can access what happens in the court, and you can access stuff like that. Then on the claim of like a world treaty would exist anyways, not mutually exclusive at all. I think that there's the incentive to do world treaty. It would exist anyways, but also how would you check on the world treaty? You sign a piece of paper. Who the fuck would check about it and care? Then about lobbying, I think the responses is fair to opening opposition, but we expand the power of the queen. This isn't just the queen lobbies against the king, but rather the queen lobbies the whole royal court. She talks to advisors, she creates balls, she does a lot of intrigue internally. And lastly, on the claim of do you trust your daughter? Yes, because A, you still grew up with the daughter and interacted with her, and B, you educated the daughter. So if you educated the daughter to be loyal as per opening government, and then she comes to the court and has your education, you're likely to trust that she's working for you, and therefore acquiesce far more to the court, because you know that there's a person who has interest in you there. Very proud to oppose.